Cumpsty from Weber State University. Thanks for having me. My paper is entitled Chris Abani's Transnational Bodies, Scaling Neoimperial Realities. Current debates in materialist post-colonial studies and world literature show the realities of empire to be ongoing and mutable, and the local-global interface to be amongst the most vexed issues in these debates. In the work of Nigerian-American author Chris Abani, the interface between local and global is most often mediated in and through the bodies of his protagonists. Analyzing the construction of what I'll call transnational bodies in Abani's Becoming Abigail and Graceland, I illustrate how the artful embodiment of Abani's globalized protagonists facilitates a scaling from global neo-imperialism to its intimate bodily effects. The transnational experience of these protagonists takes on a distinctly somatic register, as Abigail marks her skin with scars and as Elvis uses the costume of his namesake. In this way, Abani constructs not only transnational subjects, but transnational bodies. Thus, I argue firstly that in form and content, in the representation of bodies and the use of somatic metaphors, Abani's fiction invites modes of reading that scope between the global and local, between the often intangible forces of the world system and the bodies forced to experience it as precarious mobility and physical vulnerability. Second, these bodies and subjects respond to these systemic uncertainties by performing acts of resistance through rooting and assertions of belonging. I'm working with the Warwick Research Collective's definition of world literature, a single but radically uneven world system, a singular modernity combined and uneven, and a literature that variously registers this combined unevenness in both its form and its content to reveal itself as, properly speaking, world literature. The Rec maintain that it is, quote, precisely in the resistance of the enforced and involuntary conditions of migration and flexible existence that the creativity and dynamism of contemporary humanity's human subjects are best seen. That is, such subjects often fully realize themselves in acts of rooting and habitation, rather than through acts of uprooting and travel. Abani's writing provides a formal and visual vocabulary that allows us to interpret the intimate, tangible realities of uneven capitalist modernity, as well as the strategies of local resistance enacted on and through the body. Becoming Abigail follows an adolescent girl's formation of selfhood in response to experiences of parental loss, human trafficking, and sexual violation. When Abigail's body is smuggled into England under a false name by her uncle Peter, she's orphaned and stateless. She is a commodity. While this is a carefully narrated story of bodily reclamation, as Abigail's embodiment of her physical form is signified in her ritual scarification, Abani also makes explicit the transnational and neo-imperial commodity chains that bind post-colonial nations to the British Empire. The novella's transnational connections are evidenced in the opening with the inclusion of a famous London landmark, Cleopatra's Needle. Quote, the obelisk, an Egyptian souvenir, had been a gift from Muhammad Ali. The monument stands as a cipher for the uneven international histories of England, Egypt, and the US, with the needle's twin being in New York and the other pair split between Paris and Luxor, where it remains in situ. These Egyptian artifacts were appropriated, gifted, and bartered for political and financial gain. As Abigail sits astride one of the sphinxes looking up at the needle, the commodification of Abigail's body and its movement across national borders is echoed in and indexed by the colonial history of this Egyptian artifact, re-erected in centers of metropolitan power. Such links are further clarified through Abigail's obsession with maps, which incorporate cartographical technologies into the narrative. Abigail is fascinated by, quote, the black lines of science, carving things into sections, longitude, latitude, pretending that here, at least, on the flat spread of the map, it was possible to have any kind of dominion over a landscape, over things. The thing Abigail wishes to have dominion over, to know with some certainty, is her mother, quote, and sometimes the alchemy of her stare transmuted the parchment into her mother's skin. Thus, Abigail appreciates maps because of the scaling and taxonomic technologies they provide. They allow her to scale down and embody not only the ethereal figure of her mother, but also her own uncertain place in the world. Abani's prose scopes from the landscape to the map, from the synecdoche of the map to the synecdoche of the body. This scaling between the world and the body is developed further as Abigail's ritual scarification creates a map on her skin. In the only instance of a purported speech in the text, she explains her markings to her lover Derek. This one is you, this me, quote. In the middle is Greenwich, here, end quote. Abigail's scarification is an act of reclamation, an act of agency that asserts her possession of her body. Her scars also signify the location of her physical form. The repetition of here appears both as reference to an individual scar and as a declaration of presence. Abigail is here in London, and yet the inclusion of the Greenwich line on her body signifies her own liminal transnational condition. She uses her skin to mediate her relation to self and her relation to place, and in doing so, she is not only a transnational subject, but marks her body as such. Abigail's transnational subjectivity is echoed in the formal structure of the novella, since it is organized in a series of temporal snippets that jump between now, where Abigail sits alongside the Thames embankment next to the Needle, just before she commits suicide, and then, as she retrospectively considers the events that have brought her to this present. The temporal division of the world has spatial reference as well, with Abigail and her body tracing routes between Lagos and London. Becoming Abigail and Graceland have a similar narrative structure. While the first shifts between now and then, the second moves between Afikpo in the early 1970s, where Elvis spent his early childhood, and Lagos in the 1980s, where he spends his adolescence in the slum neighborhood of Makoro. Elvis ekes out a meager living as an Elvis impersonator, but as the narrative develops, Elvis moves from one temporary form of employment to another until he is operating in Lagos's shadow economy, transporting drugs and human organs. Stacey Balkin argues the novel should be read as a post-colonial or neo-imperial picaresque novel that sutures corporeal descriptions of life in Makoro within an episodic narrative that defies the chrononormativity of the development paradigm. Graceland's historical moment, Balkin continues, is undergirded by the peculiar logic of capitalist ascent that ignores the material substrate of labor and suffering that makes capital accumulation possible. It is not merely that labor and suffering undergird the novel, rather these are the very conditions that it foregrounds. Firstly, in the construction of Elvis's immediate environment, quote, he lives at the left edge of the swamp city of Makoro, connected to the rest of the suspended city through meandering plankways. And secondly, in the corporeal descriptions that emphasize Elvis's daily vulnerability as he tries to make enough money to buy his next meal. Thus, through Abani's prose, which rely on somatic description, the systematically determined insecurity of Elvis's position is made evident. The imbrication of capitalist accumulation and uneven development is illustrated in the Neoimperial specter of the US that haunts the episodic narrative. This at once taunting and aspirational specter frames much of Elvis's reality. Not only is he named after the famous singer who he impersonates, he has his own lexicon of, quote, Americanisms. Elvis's negotiation of his uneven relation to the US and its cultural imperialism is made visible through his transformation into the singer Elvis. In an illustrative scene, Elvis performs his routine for a family of American tourists. Abani carefully notes Elvis's transformation from slum dweller to impersonator. Quote, with a defeated sigh, he turned to the small tin of talcum powder. He took out a handful and applied a thick layer, peering into the mirror. He was dissatisfied. This was not how white people looked. While the narrator remarks that it was spellbinding, watching Elvis hover over the sand, movements as fluid as a wave, the gargantuan-bellied tourist asks, quote, what do you think he's doing? The disjuncture between the narrator's description and that of the tourist's audience at once signifies the potential of Elvis's masquerade and the interpretive distance between himself and his audience. Balkin notes that this is an explicit evocation of the picaresque trope of a masquerade that reminds the reader that Lagos, Abani's Graceland, is a sham. Elvis's performance of the masquerade is also a transnational transformation. Wearing the white makeup later in the novel, Elvis wonders, quote, what if he was born white, or even just American? Would his life be any different? End quote. Being the, quote, him, Elvis lives in the slums and operates in the shadow economies of the city that petrol and the perpetuation of imperialism have made possible. As the rogue of the post-colony, as Balkin describes him, Elvis not only signifies the lives displaced by Nigeria's petro economy, he also figures the strategies of habitation that seek albeit unequally and unevenly, to reconcile their relation to the system and belonging within the spaces they call home. For Elvis, dancing is one of these strategies. As he hovers over the sand, the other is reading, and Abani's careful literary allusions in the novel are an additional aspect of Graceland's transnational scope. In the final pages of the novel, as Elvis waits to board his plane to the US, he reads James Baldwin's Going to Meet the Man. Quote, "He began to see a lot of parallels between himself and the description of a black man slowly being engulfed by flame. And when this man's genitalia are cut off by an unnamed white man, Elvis wonders what kind of scar this would leave. He knew that scar, that pain, that shame, the degradation that no metaphor could contain, inscribing it on his body, and yet beyond that, he was that scar, carved by hate and smallness and fear onto the world's face. In post-Bloom Lagos, Elvis is the otherwise invisible human surplus that Abani insists on making visible. And while dancing and reading are part of Elvis's mode of habitation, both within his body and in his environment, these very strategies signify the transnational links of the world system that contribute to the impoverishment and displacement of his family. By illustrating the intimate physical and epistemological struggles of his protagonists, situated within their material histories, Abani's writing facilitates a scaling, however unevenly, between a single scarred body and the sometimes intangible systemic conditions that inform Elvis and indeed Abigail's reality. In Abigail and Graceland, in Becoming Abigail and Graceland, Abani writes rogue narratives of the periphery and semi-periphery, tracing multi-directional routes rich with complexity. Abani does not only make these pathways visible through the routes traveled in his fiction, he also, through his bodily metaphors and corporeal descriptions, relies on the vulnerability of his protagonists' bodies to illustrate and index the sometimes abstract forces of the world system, such as forced migration, food and labor insecurity, underdevelopment, that determine the lived realities of Abani's protagonists. To read the transnational bodies in Abani's fiction is to read the bodily vocabulary of scars, signs, costume, and masquerade that make visible and visceral aspects of the capitalist world system, contrapuntally with the strategies of belonging and habitation that resist the precarious conditions of involuntary migration and flexible existence. Thank you very much.